Okay, let's discuss FKIK by making some FKIK arms very simply. We're not going to go too much into the fingers, but we'll do for the shoulder, elbow, wrist, typical arm setup. There's a great video on YouTube from Doodly. The name is kind of cut off there, and make sure to include this in the description. But this dude is great. He discusses a lot of animation, 3D animation techniques and subjects that you could easily kind of get the definitions of. But yeah, like right there, like the two things, right? That's what the difference between an FK and IK is rotation versus position. And we're going to get that built. But more importantly, we're going to have a bind joints that is going to be dictated or dictating the actual geometry it's going to be bound to. But then we're going to have two other sets of joints. One that's going to be IK and one's going to be FK that we can blend between. It could be like, we can go to IK mode or we can go to FK mode. So that's what we're going to build. But I do highly recommend watching this whole video all the way through. He has a lot of great examples and discussions about a lot of various portions of this, and it's a wonderful video, especially if you've never been exposed to FKIK and this is kind of new terminology. And I'll explain as we go along. I'm going to create the joints. I'm going to go to lighting and say use flat lighting. That way, because we've got this weird shading going on. I think it's just the normals on this model is a little odd. But regardless, I'm going to go up to the top view and build my joints here for a very technical reason. And I'm going to zoom in specifically on the character's left arm, screen right, as I create these joints. And you're going to see some stuff happen. We won't see it immediately in the front view. We'll have to move it up. But you'll see it here in the perspective view being made at the world origin. But there's a very technical reason we want a pretty straight line in the front view. Let's go ahead and get those joints created though. So I'm gonna go to my rigging toolkit, and the second button is the create joint tool, or we can go to our rigging toolkit here and say skeleton create joints. So I'm going to create 3 joints. So make sure to turn shading X-ray joints on so we can see my joint size is really small. So let's increase that to 0.1. So the same as 1. That should be good. So I'm going to create these 3 joints as such. And actually, I'm going to kind of continue that out to create a 4th joint. So I've got my shoulder, my elbow, and I'm being particular about where I'm placing these, trying to line them up with some edge loops that would work really well. I've got my wrist, and then I'm going to do a hand end joint. So it's just a joint that's at the end of the hand. And this particular joint that I just made at the very tip, I'm going to label an end joint, and it's not going to actually have any particular bindings to it, but instead it's going to be a really nice joint for us to be able to determine the direction and encompass area of the previous joint for the wrist. I'll hit enter to finalize all those joints, but you can see none of them are in the front view. So I'm going to zoom out here and you can see them. They're all perfectly straight. You can see this is a pretty important topic. So let's see if I can just make these a little bit larger here. There we go. You can see here in the top view, I put a bend in the elbow. This is a very technical reason. And, just starting out learning this stuff, there's a very technical reason we want to do this. And essentially when we build that IK structure here in a bit, if we don't determine and tell Maya, hey, here's where the bend of that elbow is, Maya is going to randomly determine it for itself. And it's going to choose an orientation and axis that probably aren't going to be what we, the artists, want. So instead, I'm going to build that bend in the top view. But the other trick to this is in this front orthographic view, this needs to be a straight line. We can eventually break this rule, but as we start to learn FKIK and learn how to use this, we're going to start using this for now. Like, we're just going to make sure that we have the straight line to match up. And I've made this geometry, I've edited this geometry, I should say, to make sure that you all can follow this easily and have like a nice straight line from the shoulder to the wrist. There we go. And all I did there to move that up was select that first joint in the chain and move up on translate Y. So it now lines up with the geometry there a little bit better. I don't really care about the side view. If I can go to panels, layouts, 3 panes split left, it'll kind of give me a similar view to what I was just taking a look at. Shading, X-ray joints, and I'll do lighting Use flat lighting. We'll change our background so something a little bit easier for us to work with. Cool. So there we go. Again, from this front view, I want these to be a perfectly straight line. This last joint, reminder, it's not going to matter for binding. It's also not going to matter for our IK chain. We're going to end our IK chain at the wrist. We're not going to end it at the tip of the hand. So we can just point this one down so it just flows naturally with that hand a little bit better, and we get a little bit better of a visual orientation here with this pyramid. This is not the actual orientation of the joint. We will discuss more of that as we move forward. Don't worry about that for now. I'm going to name these joints, but as a reminder, what I was saying a second ago is particularly what I want to name these. Sorry, I'm just going to close in some extra stuff out. Is not just joint 1, joint 2, joint 3, or not even just like shoulder, elbow, wrist, or hand in, anything like that. I want to make sure to include a couple of things. First off, I want to make sure to include an L underscore at the beginning because this is the character's left arm. Not only that, but I'm going to put in a bind, B-I-N-D, and then I'll put an underscore. Now I'll put shoulder, because that's what this one is. And then I'll put JNC at the end because this is my naming convention. By no means is this every naming convention that ever exists, but to me, it's very descriptive of what I have selective. And as long as anybody else other than yourself can look at your naming convention and understand what joint that they are selecting and working with, you're golden. So you can ask your buds, you can ask your classmates, your teacher, whoever, be like, hey, does this naming convention make sense? So that's my shoulder. L underscore bind underscore, which we can then, copy and paste. Be very careful about copying and pasting. Control-C, Control-V in Maya. Make sure your cursor is selected in the window where you want to. We don't want to paste in the 3D viewport because that can cause some chaos. So just make sure you're selected over here. This is going to be the elbow joint, bind, wrist joint, and bind, hand, end. I'll put end in caps and JNT and not in caps. The reason I did that is I just like to never bind anything to end joints. That way, when I see that end in all caps when I go to skin weight later, I'm going to know the difference here. Cool. So we've got our structure here set up. Now, the fun thing is we need 2 more of this exact same structure, not because we're going to mirror it. We'll talk about mirroring later, but instead because we just need 2 different structures for this. I need a left and a right side. So I need not only left and right, but I need an FK and an IK version of this. My brain just got caught up and did hiccup. So I'm going to select that and Control D to duplicate. I can open that up. Here we have everything. And I could go through and rename these, but I'm going to use Maya's search and replace feature. So I'll select all these, or I think we can just select the top one here. We'll go to modify, search and replace. And we get this window here. So we can search for and replace with. If you are familiar with this tool in like Excel or Word or any other editing software, it's going to be a very similar tool. I want to search for underscore bind underscore, and I want to replace with underscore FK underscore. If I have hierarchy selected, it's only going to do it to my selected hierarchy. So if I have this parent selected, everything in that hierarchy, which is its children, will be applied with this search and replace. If I do selected, it'll only go off what I have selected. So it would only do this parent and not the children. I'll leave it to hierarchy because that's what we want. The reason I included bind or underscores with the bind rather is because if for some reason my word out here had bind in it, I don't want it to accidentally replace that. So I always just like to make sure to still include my underscores. And I will say apply. There we go. Get rid of the pesky 1 at the end of that one now. We'll do this again. Duplicate. Search for FK. Replace with IK. There we go. Get rid of that pesky 1 at the end. Another way we could have done this is I could have just made, the shoulder joints and named them all. And then I could have went up here, selected them all and said modify prefix hierarchy names. And where's that window? There it is. What this is going to do is give us a way to add in another prefix. So if I just say OK here, you can see it adds a prefix underscore of that. We don't need that right now, but that's just another way to have achieved the same task. OK. I believe I'm ready to zoom back out. And yeah. So again, just to talk about this process, we have the bind joints, we have the FK, and because we duplicated them, they're all on top of each other. And then we have the IK. And they're all the same joint system, but essentially the only one that's going to be running the show are these bind joints. And these are going to be oriented to the top row of joints or the bottom row, FK or IK, depending on what we build the control to tell it to do. And we want to give that control to the animator. So that's what we're working towards. Right now, I want to go ahead and just build my FK controls. So I will take my bind joints and my IK joints. I'll take their parents and hide them, just H on the keyboard. Let's lift me with the FK shoulder joint, elbow joint, and wrist joint. So I'm good to start working here. I'm going to go up to curves. We're going to create a circle, and we're going to create FK joints, or controls for these joints, rather. And to define again what FK means is it's forward kinematics. So if I select this first joint and I start rotating it, it's built off of rotations. Everything beneath it moves with it. If I select the child and start rotating it, everything beneath it moves with it, but the parent remains the same, and then same thing for the wrist. So we are forward kinematics, means we start from the parent and work our way down the chain of the child based on the rotations and technically translations, but don't worry too much about that right now. I have created a NURB circle to create controls for these. But what I like to do is create offset groups. We've talked about this before, but just to drive the point home, with that circle selected, I will group it to itself while it's at the world origin. And then over here, I can rename this. So I can, I no longer need NURB circle. I can say, okay, this is going to be the L underscore shoulder control. And then this is going to be the L underscore shoulder control underscore GRP. For offset group. Now, this offset group is very important for FK control specifically because we want to match the orientation of the joints. What does that mean? I'm going to select that offset group. I'm going to take it to that joint, the first one, the corresponding shoulder joint, right? And I'm going to say modify, match transformations, and I'll say match all. And it's going to snap that to the top group. The fun thing about this is with that offset group, you can see by using that match transformation function, we have now matched the orientation of that joint. So if I select it and go to the manipulator, it follows and points down the orientation of this joint. So it's pointing down that chain. If I was to freeze this offset group, it's going to get rid of that. So we never freeze the offset group. And this is just one purpose of one offset group. Offset groups can have all sorts of different purposes. We'll discuss more on that later as we move forward. That being said, this is just an offset group right now for matching the orientation of this joint. I can now go to my shoulder control, and I don't want it like intersecting the arm like this. I want it like encompassing the arms, like a hula hoop, right? I want like a strap around the arm. So I'm going to take that control, not the offset group, take the control, rotate it 90 degrees, and I can freeze its transforms. Check this out. Even though I froze that control's transforms after rotating it, it still matches the orientation of the joint. That's because of that offset group, which is so important for this particular workflow. Again, offset groups can have a bunch of different functions. In this particular case, it's taking these rotation and translate values, applying it to all of its children, which receive it, but then we can zero out that children. And remember, this control is going to be what the animator goes to grab. One thing that I can also do before I continue moving on too deep into this is I'll select both of those, or just the parent. I'll do a modify, search and replace, and I'll search for L underscore, and I'll replace with L underscore FK underscore. That way I just have, this is the FK control, right? We'll build an IK control. We won't have an IK shoulder control, but still good to let the animator know what control they have selected. Okay, I know to just duplicate this a couple times, once for the elbow and once for the wrist. So first duplication, I'm going to then take that new offset group to the elbow, just so you can see it in all perspectives, and say modify, match transformations, match all. I'll duplicate it one more time, that offset group, and I'll take it to my wrist. Modify, match transformations, match all. So now I have a series of controls around my joints. Their orientations all match the orientation of their corresponding joint. This one's a little off because remember we moved that last joint down after creating the joints, and to match that orientation we have to go through an extra couple of steps. We will circle back to how to do this later, but I don't want to do too much information overload. Just trying to get the idea of FK-IK switches across today. I need to rename all of these controls. So I'm going to say replace the shoulder here with wrist. Same thing here. Wrist. And it'll take me just a second to rename these, not too long. And then not a wrist this time, but an elbow. And an elbow. All right. The problem here is this does not function like our FK chain. So when I go to rotate the first joint, everything rotates with it, but when I go to rotate the first control, nothing else moves with it. Very simple here. We just need to replicate the hierarchy of this joint structure in our controls. And we do not want to parent offset groups to offset groups, but instead directly under the controls. So what does that look like? I'm going to take the wrist, parent it under the elbow control. So the wrist offset group into the elbow control. Then I'll take the elbows offset group and parent it under the shoulder control. And so now, since they have this lineage, this hierarchy, we can rotate the first one and it rotates everything subsequently. We're getting really close to having our FK chain built. There is one more step of constraining these controls to the joints, but we'll save that for here in a second. Because I want to mirror these joints first. In fact, before we start building our IK controls, let's go ahead and do that. I'll unhide my left bind and left IK group, and also add to this selection my left FK group, this joint structure. I'll go up to my rigging toolkit. I'll go down to skeleton, mirror joints option box. And what we're going to do is mirror all of these selected joints. I think actually I have to have these individually selected, but we'll try anyway. A good way to remember which way we're going to mirror is like, okay, cool. I'm looking here. I can see my manipulator down here, right? I can see that it's, let's see if I get the objects on screen at the same time. There we go. Sorry, the monitor, the magnifying is going crazy. But I can see that I want to mirror left to right, because if we zoom out, you can see my other arm over here. So I wanted to take it over here to this side. So I'm going on X. So I'm taking from X to the other side, the negative X essentially. A good way to remember that for these options though, that don't include just straight up a singular axis, just remember that you're mirroring across the two axes that it would. Like, so if you imagine the YZ plane, the 2D plane here as a mirror, it would literally be reflecting on the other side of X. Another way I remember this, or used to when I first started out, was I would find the axis I want to mirror across, and I see, oh, hey, you know, there's XY, there's YZ, there's XZ. One of these does not have X. That's the one I need. And your mileage may vary depending on your independent projects, but for now, that's works well. We're also going to search for, you probably guessed it, L underscore replaced with R underscore, because this is the character's right arm. Real quick before I hit apply, we'll briefly talk about mirror function. We'll talk more about this a little bit later when we talk about joint orientation. That being said, for arms, we typically want behavior, and for legs, we typically want orientation. A good way I remember that, a student taught me a couple years ago, is we behave with our arms. People act out with their arms. They're overactive with their arms, but then we orient ourselves as we walk forward with our legs. So since we're doing arms, we're gonna leave that to behavior. Say apply. It did not work. And if we check a look in the script editor, it says error. Oops, you can see I was importing a some camera stuff, but whatever. It says error, too many arguments, expected 1, found 0. Well, in fact, you found 3, but that's okay. So you just need to have one of these selected each time you do this. So I'm going to select that first one, go back to skeleton, mirror. All of our settings should be the same. I'll now hit apply, and you should be able to see this happen now in the 3D viewport when I do. There we go. I just now need to do that for each of them. That was the bind. So I now need to do the FK, RFK, and the IK, RIK. Cool. So the reason I wanted to do these now is because when we do mirror our joints, if they had constraints on them, it would mirror the constraints as well. And same for IK handles. The reason we don't want to do that is very simply put, I just, I don't want to have an empty constraint that doesn't function properly, or an IK handle that might mess up. I don't want to duplicate that stuff. So I just like to mirror clean joints. That way we are golden to start working with building their connectors up. I'm going to hide all of those now. And I'll just go back to messing with my FK shoulder. So I'll hide my left IK and my left bind and all of my right joints for now. And now I just need to build simple constraints from here to here. We could use orient constraints technically, but I find that parent constraints work better. I think there's a technical definition of why that is, but I'm struggling to recall it right now off the top of my head. That being said, I'm going to build a constraint from this control, the parent, to the child, which is the joint. So I'm going to say, hey, parent, constrain my child. So order of operations of selection is parent, then child. Constrain, parent option box. Maintain offset. We don't need translate for FK, so I'm going to uncheck that. We do need rotate, so I'm going to leave that checked and hit apply. Then I'm going to go through and do that for both of these. By the way, G on your keyboard repeats the last tool used, which is the parent constraint. Apply. So now whenever I go to rotate these controls, after I've done that for each of them, the control not only manipulates the joint, or not only manipulates, the subsequent joints in its chain, but also the corresponding joint that we've constrained it to. Fantastic. That's our FK controls built. Let's build our IK controls. Let's talk about that, because FK is forward kinematics being driven by rotation here. Let's show our left IK. IK is going to be determined by position. And that might sound a little bit odd. I'll demonstrate it and we'll talk more about how to use it. But this tool can be found under Skeleton, Create IK Handle. There it is. You can open the option box, and I typically recommend it because I do enable sticky. And here we go, shoulder. There we go. I think I misclicked it there and got an error. So I'm going to go from the shoulder to the wrist. We're skipping the elbow. And essentially what happens is it'll create a handle at the wrist, at the last joint you selected, and everything between the first and last joint will automatically rotate based off of the position of the IK handle. So it's going to position that last joint that you clicked wherever you put that IK handle, but then everything else subsequently will rotate with it. So this is what FK versus IK is, position versus rotation. This is really nice for if we wanted to have somebody's hand on a table, or for feet, like leaning up against something. Punches are really nice in this mode. Certain arcs are kind of easier in IK, but most arcs are easier in FK. So it's just, you got to vary in your situations when you or the animator would use these. I'm going to undo all those movements. Something to take note of is when I go to rotate this, nothing happens. So we got to address that as we create our controls. I'm going to rename this. This is going to be the L_IK_handle. Name that what you would like, but I just want to make sure I know that it's the left IK handle. We'll come back and talk about this white pizza pie slice that showcases whenever you select your IK handle. But now we need to create our controls for this side as well. We're not going to need 3, we're only going to need 2. So I'm going to go up to curves, create a circle, immediately group it to itself, giving myself a offset group for that circle. Name it L_IK_wrist CTRL. And then name it the same for the offset group and match that to the wrist joint. Modify, match transforms. So exactly what we did on the FK side, and I still need to also rotate this 90 degrees and freeze transforms of the circle itself, not the offset group, but the circle. Now I have a corresponding wrist joint there, and control, I should say. Cool. I'm going to do the same thing for the elbow. So I'm going to duplicate that offset group and say modify, match all. This isn't really a problem, but the problem here is this is not how the elbow operates for IK. To fix this, and I'll demonstrate it. In fact, actually, I'm just going to make a new control, because you can see here in the top view, that control has the orientation of that joint, and I don't necessarily need that. So I'm actually going to delete that and create a new control. And speaking on even more of a technical term, we don't really need an offset group here, but I like to be in the habit of creating one anyway. So L_IK_ elbow control. Give it an offset group. I always like offset groups. They're just good habits. It's a good habit to always make those. This time when I match this offset group to this joint, all I'm going to do is say modify, match, translation. Because you can specifically choose if you want to match translation, rotation, or scale, or pivots. But I'm just going to do translate. Instead of rotating 90 degrees so that it hula hoops around the elbow, I'll rotate it 90 degrees so that it like kind of encompasses and cuts through the arm. But I'm not going to leave it there. Oh, and we can freeze that because that was on the control, right? So I can go back up and say freeze, zero that out. We'll delete history as well. I'm going to go to the group, and instead of moving the control, I'm going to move that offset group away. This is the only time that I want to move an offset group based off of what we've discussed thus far. Again, a bunch of offset groups have a bunch of different reasons for existing. This particular case is just to help us get orientation, but the way this elbow control works is not going to be an orientation. The way to think about that here, kind of hard to see, is this elbow is always going to be pinned and pointed towards this control. It's kind of like an aim constraint. But let's talk about what that looks like. Let me go back one more time. There we go. We're not going to use what an aim constraint is. We're going to use a constraint we've not talked about yet. We have parent, point, orient, and scale, aim, all great. Pull vector, we've not discussed at all. This is going to create our aim towards this elbow control for our IK. And the way this works is we're going to say, hey parent, because we're constraining the action of another object. Hey parent, constrain your child. And we select the IK handle. And we add a pull vector constraint. Let's talk about what that does. So if I select the IK handle, you'll be able to see it. I'll isolate it so you can even see it a little bit better. But from the beginning to the end, we have a pull, a straight line. And then from the beginning, we have a direction that that pull will rotate a vector that it's looking for, an X, Y, and Z coordinate at the very tip of that line that it's looking for. And what that equates to, and you can see it here, that joint is always going to be, maybe that might be a little bit more visible, that joint's always going to be looking at wherever, aimed at wherever that is. So you can see here, if I have it right here and I just move left, right, nothing really changes a bunch. It does a little bit, but not a lot. Up and down, really, it's just going to be pointed at where you're looking. That's how we control the direction of an elbow here. There is something called a little bit more of an advanced control, where we could have an elbow pin and like you can lean on your elbows on the table. You don't gotta worry about that for your day. We also need to get this IK handle following this wrist control. I'm going to select the control, select the IK handle, and say constrain parent, or I could do a direct parent here as well. I'm going to leave it to a constraint today, and I need to make sure if I do, because earlier I turned off my translates. I need to turn that back on. Rotates actually don't matter here, because remember, whatever the IK handle rotates, it doesn't move. But now this wrist control moves that wrist. The problem right now is that last joint, right? And that's why I created this, right? Is so that we can see the orientation of this joint right here. As we move it around, it's automatically rotating based off of the orientation of the previous joint in the chain. That is not what your animator will want. I can just say that right this second. So what I'm going to do instead is select that control, select the corresponding joint, and say constrain orient. And what that's going to do is it'll allow, hey, whenever I rotate this control, it moves that joint. So again, that was, I'll repeat myself, you select the control, then the joint, not the IK handle, but the joint, constrain orient. So now whenever I move this around, You see like someone placing their hand on a table and then adjusting where their elbow is aimed at. Cool. That's our IK controls done. They'll connect into the body, and we could take it a step further and talk about space switching, but again, we'll keep it pretty light for today. We'll come back and talk about space switching another day. So how do we get these two connected to each other, our left and our right? So if I go back to my left FK and both the controls and the joints and show them, you can see an issue here, right? Is the IKs are identical or the controls for the wrist are identical and overlapped on top of each other. So I'm going to hide my FK controls and let's talk about some fun stuff. We talked a lot about technical stuff, but let's talk about color coding and shapes and making this look nice. I want this wrist control for the IK to look slightly different. So with it selected, I'm going to hit Control 1. I like to do this because it allows me to easily select the control vertices. So I can right click and hold, go to component mode, and say control vertex. And what I like to do, and this is just me, you can shape this however you'd like, but I like to select every other one and scale those in to create kind of like a star. And so when I unisolate, it's pretty easy to see the differences between that circle, and if I bring back my FK controls, and that outer circle. So the animator now knows the very large visual difference between the star and the circle. So I know this one's IK and this one's FK. We can take that a step further. I'm also going to do the same thing for the elbow control. I'm not gonna like make a star, but I'll make it a little bit smaller, and then I'll select the two edges, and we can also enable soft select here, just like you can for vertices. And I'll make it kind of like encompass a little bit. I think that's fine. Yeah, I think it's a little mouth. Make it shape, whatever shape you want. Let's take this a step further though with color coding. I'll select my first FK control and I'm going to go to the attribute editor. Over here in my, let's move this on the screen here so you can see both the control and what we're looking at over here. In the attribute editor on the right side of the screen, we can pull up, if you don't see it by the way, you can click this button at the top. It'll open your attribute editor window. We can open up our shape tab and go down to object display, drawing overrides, enable overrides. This gives us some overrides to play around with, but the most important one is the color. You want to change this from index. This is how it used to be. It was god awful to work with, but you would have to scrub through and find what you want to work with. So if I wanted that color to be white, I'd have to scrub through and find that. But we can change from index to RGB and have our traditional color wheel once we click this black box. I've joked for years, it's less of a joke nowadays, but still fun to think about, and I think it gets people in the right mindset, is I color code all the controls based off of the political system in the United States, right? Right is red, left is blue, everything down the middle is yellow. And that's worked pretty well for me to remember it, but you can make this whatever you'd like. What I do recommend is making, one side of the controls entirely one color and one side of the other controls an entirely different color. So red, green, blue, red, purple, green, I don't know, whatever color code you want, but that way it's easy for the animator to see, oh, this is the left arm because it's blue. Oh, this is the right arm because it's red, whatever, what have you. So I can go through and color each of these now a slightly different shade of blue, but I'm going to make sure all the FK ones are the same colors. You can also see your most recently used colors in this box here, which makes it really nice and convenient. I wish we could do a couple of these all at once. Whoops, object display, drawing overrides. But sadly we can't. I'll zoom out now so you know where I'm at. I just wanted to show you where those menus were. I will make my wrist control a RGB, a slightly different shade of blue, but still blue nonetheless. Simply because since it's still blue, I still know it's the left side, but it's a different shape, so I know it's a different control. So this is the IK. I'll do that the same for that IK wrist. So the animator now knows a little bit of a distinction between these. If you're like me and you're getting up there in age, your eye is not that great, I can hardly see these thin lines, so I like to make these a little bit thicker as well. In the same area in our attribute editor, we go to the very bottom to extra attributes, and right there is the line width. I like to set these between -1 and 3. Anything above that can look a little odd and be a little too thick in the animator's way. But I'm going to take all of my lines and set them to a line width of 3 so I can easily see them. Superb. Nice. So I've got one side done, so I just need to do the same thing to the other side. And we've got our systems going. I'll really quickly talk about mirroring controls, although I don't super recommend it. I just like to rebuild these, but it does make it consistent so it doesn't look too odd. And I do this, so I do recommend this now that I think about it. But I don't want to recommend like duplicating the IK handle or any of the constraints. We don't have a mirror tools, like a mirror controls function. What I'm going to do is select all of my controls though and group them to themselves. So I'm just going to select all of those, hit Control G. I don't have to rename this because it's a temporary group. With group 1 selected here, I will duplicate them. So we have group 2. And with group 2, so you're going to laugh at how easy this is. With group 2, I'm going to take that, I can see, okay, I want to go across X. So I'm going to take that scale X to -1. And technically we can freeze the transforms here. In fact, I'll do that and delete history, but it does kind of mess a few things up if you do that. The orientation of the corresponding controls, I think, gets a little backwards, but it's actually kind of what you want. I know this looks wrong, but if I bring up, if you see this joint here, this is actually the whole thing I was talking about earlier of the orientation. That's the shoulder control. I need the elbow control. Oh, that's for the IK. Where's the FK shoulder elbow? There we go. So you can see, oh, interesting. Oh, it froze it on that group. Okay, hold on 1 second here. Okay, yeah, I'll run through that again, but essentially you do not want to freeze. I'll ungroup the first one. Essentially you do not want to freeze the main group there because it does get rid of the orientation that we've built. But you can see that orientation remains if you do not freeze that group. So I'll replicate that again so you can kind of see how I did that. That's that side. So again, just take all your controls, group them together, duplicate that group, and mirror across -X or X -1. And then you can take both of those groups and say edit ungroup. And we just need to go through and rename all of the replicated ones. So I'll select those. I'll do a modify, search and replace. Search for L_replace with. Don't need to search for replace with L_FK because my IK is also duplicated there. Replace with not L_ but R_. Apply. So now all of these should be, yep. You can see there R_, R_. Very nice. And then now all that's left is to do the same thing I did a second ago, but do the color coding different this time. Again, however you would like to set these up. I'm going to stick to my poor political joke of R, or right equals red, left equals blue. And a slightly different shade of red. Maybe this time instead of like a red, we do like an orange. Not quite too different from red, maybe more of a yellow orange. There we go. And my most recent color, if I made a custom one, is going to be right there. Easy for me to replicate. And then I can also update their line widths as well. Wish we could do this for multiple selected. I don't believe it still works that way. You gotta have to do one at a time. We could use scripting to help us do this, by the way, but just to talk about the basics for now. And now I have that side done. I can show those controls and I can get everything constrained up like I did over here with our parent constraints, orient constraints, or not orient constraints. Orient constraint for the IK wrist joint, but then also the pole vector constraint as well. Last but not least is we have our two systems built, but we have still our bind joints here. So essentially we just need to get a structure built for these. I need to take a brief break, but we need to get a structure built so that we can blend these to one system or the other. In order to do that, I'm going to create a new control. So I'll go to curves, create a new control. I'll give it an offset group as well. So we'll group it to itself to create an offset group. And I'll call this L_FK IK switch. And I will give it a name of the offset group the same. So L underscore FKIK switch underscore group. And I will move this up to the wrist joint. So I will select that offset group to the wrist joint, modify, match all transforms. But more importantly, I'll take it to kind of float above that wrist. We'll make it a smaller circle. I could take a little bit more time to kind of like, I will actually, to make it just a little bit more shaped uniquely, because essentially this is going to be what the animator will select to toggle between FK or IK. So I've got it in position here. I need to freeze the transforms of the control, but not the offset group. But it didn't really matter for this one, so we can freeze the transforms of that one. Kind of doesn't matter. Regardless, I've got my nice control here for that made, and I need this to now follow the wrist wherever it goes. But remember, we have two versions, right? We have our FK or IK. So instead of this controller controlling something else for the translates, rotations, or anything, we're going to have the bind wrist joint. It's going to be the parent, and then the child's going to be that LFK switch offset group. So constrain, parent, both translate and rotate are on. So now whenever that bind wrist joint moves, it's going to take that control with it. We can also select it, do our same thing we've done previously, give it a color. I'll stick with that light blue and a very thick line. Cool, so it's easier for the animator to see. Awesome, so we've got that created. We've got a lot of work to do to get this to function properly though. First and foremost, we need to add a new attribute. So with this control selected, we're going to hop over to our channel box. We're going to say edit, add attribute. It'll pop up in this window. We're going to call this FK IK switch. And we're going to say a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. Leave everything else their default because we want this to be float essentially. And say add. You can see here we have FK IK switch now added beneath our attributes. If I middle mouse click and drag with that word selected in my 3D viewport, you can see I blend between 0 to 1. I could have went to 10, I suppose, but I think this is fine. Oops, I deselected it. All right. We can also eventually hide all the translates and rotates because we don't actually need those. So in fact, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll just select all of them. I'll leave visibility on just in case we want to manipulate it. But I can say right click, we can say lock and hide selected. So now we only have the FK IK switch here built. Right now, I just need all of my bind joints to also have a parent system. So we're going to use parent constraints from both the FK and IK joints. So I'm going to say LFK shoulder, LIK shoulder, L bind shoulder. That's the last one. So we selected our parents first and then our child. Constrain parent. I'm going to go to my options just to make sure my settings have maintain offset, translate, and rotate turned on. And I'll add that on there. And if we check that out, right, if you select that parent constraint, go to your attribute editor over here in the channel box, you'll see we have listed, right? LFK shoulder and LIK shoulder. And remember, we've done this before. All we have to do is toggle this to one or the other. I'm going to now build that for each corresponding joint. So it's going to be LFK elbow, LIK elbow, and then L bind elbow. I'm just going to hit G on my keyboard to repeat that parent constraint function and do the same thing for the wrist. FK wrist, IK wrist, bind wrist, G. So now, essentially, if I go to move my FK and my IK, you'll see a perfect blend between these two controls, right? And the reason it's a perfect blend is we're telling the bind controls to 100% follow both of them. So it adds those together and averages those out. But what we want to do instead is set driven keys, right? We can do that with set driven keys. Let me think, is there another way we could do that? We could do it with direct connections as well. We may actually circle back and talk about how to do that. Actually, I think that's what I would prefer to do. But we'll talk about set driven keys today because we've already talked about that. But with this FK-IK switch, we're going to be in one mode or another. And how I like to build these, by the way, is if I have FK-IK switch 0 to 1, I typically put 0 being whatever I've listed first, which for me is FK. If you had listed IK first, it would be IK. And 0 would be FK, 1 would be IK in my situation. So let's go through and do that. So I'm going to go up to my animation toolkit, go to key, set driven key, set. It'll pull up this window. I need to select my control and load as the driver. And then I'm going to select all of those constraints on the bind, all those parent constraints on the bind joints, and load as the driven. And I'm just going to build these one at a time. So currently I'm going to select my control. I am in 1, which means I need to go down to my FK, and I'll highlight both of these because we need to make sure to key both of those. And instead of highlighting visibility, we'll highlight switch here for FK-IK switch. And the way I want to do this is be like, okay, cool. So my control with it selected is currently set to 1, which means I need to go over to that constraint. Currently I have the parent constraint 1. I'm going to go, in fact, actually, can we do all of these? No, we cannot do all of these at once, right? Because they all have different names for those. A little unfortunate, but that's okay. I just kind of wish it recognized something else. Sorry to get distracted there. But again, the driver will be the FK-IK switch with the switch attribute selected. The driven will be the corresponding joint. So right now we're going to do wrist with the 2 constraints that we have on it. So if you zoom in here, right, you see the LFK wrist joint, LIK wrist joint. That's what it's constrained to. So right now, if IK switches in 1, I'm going to set that wrist joint to say, hey, FK is going to be off, so it's going to be 0, and the IK is going to be on. And then I will say key. I'll go back to my control, and I'll adjust this from 1 to 0. I will now go back to my set driven keys. I'm not going to change anything here by my selection. I'll go back to my wrist joint, and I'll change over here the attribute editor, the channel box rather, the selected wrist joint. So I want to toggle, if I toggle my control to FK, I want to turn my FK on, which is a value of 1, and my IK off, which is a value of 0. And I will hit key. And now you can take a look at this, right? So when my FK-IK switch is 0, if I select my parent constraint for my wrist, it should read FK is on, which it is, IK is off. If I go back to my control and switch that on to 1, and go back to my constraint for my wrist, the opposite is now true. FK is off, IK is on. We're just going to do that for each of these now. Yeah, we'll start in IK, that's fine. I'll go down to my elbow joint. We're currently in IK on my control. I can double check that by selecting my control and seeing FK and IK. We're at 1, means I'm in IK. I'll go back to my constraint for the elbow and say, hey, LFK elbow joint is going to be off, while the LIK elbow joint constraint is going to be on. Key. Go back to my control, toggle the FK-IK switch to 0, which means FK mode. Go back to my constraint for the elbow, LFK elbow on, because that's the elbow constraint that we want to turn on. LIK elbow off. Key. Last one. Do the same thing for the shoulder. So LFK shoulder joint, we're going to toggle on, right? Because we're in FK mode. It's equaling 0. It's a little bit backwards from the order of operations I've done so far. I need to make sure to select the shoulder joint and those corresponding constraints in that list on the right. I need to make sure my FK is on while my IK is off. Key. Go back to my control, toggle it on to 1, which means I'm in IK. Go back to that joint, or that constraint rather, on that joint. FK needs to turn off. IK needs to turn on. Key. So now, whenever I rotate this up, right, I'm controlling the FK joints, And then when I go to move my IK, I'm controlling the IK joints. And when I want to switch this around, there it is, I was looking for it. I can go to my FK IK switch and toggle from FK to IK by blending. By the way, you can hold control on your keyboard so you get a more finite control over the decimals when you do this mode, where you select the name and then hold middle mouse click and drag in your viewport. That goes super quick. But if I hold control, I have a real finite control over it. But you can see that is I'm now shifting the bind to follow, hey, follow either the FK or now follow the IK. I'm telling it what to do. And the animator can select these controls if it's made a pose that it doesn't like and say 0 out, all translates and rotates. And we're back to our default. Which means at this point in the stage, by the way, save early, save often. I've not saved once since I started this. So don't be me. Do as I say, not as I do. I'm going to save, but then also I can go through and I can hide my FK and IK joints so that we're only seeing the joints of the bind. And we're only going to see our bind joints flow from the FK controls to the IK controls. Not only that, I can also just do like a quick binding of this joint here. Just a real play with it. You don't want to do this, but just to show you. Deform bind. You'll see why you don't want to do this. Oh, skin bind, my bad. But now if I go to rotate this around, you can see that we got, you can see it's just control the other side because I've not mirrored a middle joint here. Also it's like not even doing default binding as well. Well, we'll come back to bindings here a bit later. We won't quite cover that just yet. But this is the core idea of an FK bind structure. We do have a mess in our outliner that we need to go through and clean up, but we'll save cleanup discussion for a future lecture. I hope that helps. Please reach out to me if there's any questions, comments, or concerns. Oh, take care. Adios. Auf Wiedersehen. That's all I got.